Hey everyone, Zephan Blacksburg here, and in today's video we're going to do a little bit of a longer build out. This is for building out a rack case unit. I'll give you the example for my client, what we're doing here, but I'll also talk a little bit about the benefits of using a case like this. So let's jump right in. So this client is for a synagogue. We've done a lot of live streaming for them in the past, and one of the things that they mentioned was that they could really use a portable live streaming kit because they do some events outside under a tent, just outside the building, as well as in other rooms within the synagogue. Now we've installed a Atem Mini Extreme setup within the main sanctuary, but now they want something that they can kind of wheel in and just kind of pop up, plug in, and go. So this kit is going to involve putting in an Atem Mini Extreme, as well as a setup that will include the ability to use two PTZ cameras, the brand new Fuel World PTZ cameras, and we're gonna have a full parts list for you here momentarily. But this is just some background. It's to have two cameras to start, but also taking a feed from a PowerPoint computer or a laptop. So if they wanted to play back videos into their live stream or anything like PowerPoint slides, if they wanted to add PowerPoint slides into there, they could do that. So 3 inputs for now, but obviously with the space to be able to expand later down the road. Now, with there being PTZ cameras, one of the tricky parts is that we need to power the PTZs and we need to send a video signal from a long distance. So this one called for using an Ethernet cable for power, so we're using PoE. We have a PoE switch included in this kit, and then we're also running SDI cables to the cameras, which means we have to include some converters in this rack case unit to convert it back to HDMI in order to get it into the Atem. Now, there's a lot of different variations and ways that you could go about doing this. Obviously, there's NDI. I have specifically built cables that I'll also link to that are both SDI and Ethernet cables together in one cable that we can put on a reel or on a spool for the client. So this kit is a deep rack case. It's a 6 RU case. It's rolling. It's got some wheels on it. And what I was thinking was that this is probably going to live on top of a rolling cart along with a laptop that we got for them. The PTZ cameras can kind of sit on the shelf underneath the cart. We can also lay the C-stands that I got for the PTZ cameras across the bottom of the cart so they can literally wheel this cart in. This will be kind of more at switching height so someone can stand behind it and actually switch, and then they can just pull out the C-stands from the cart, pop them up, put up their PTZs, run their cables, and be good to go. So I wanted to kind of show you my mindset in building this out, how I walk through this. It's going to be a bit of a longer video, so stick with me. We'll also make sure to put some highlighted times on the screen so that you can see the different pieces or different elements if you're trying to jump ahead to just one particular part. So before I begin, I also wanted to include why we chose to do this. So this rack case, or just rack cases in general, are a much better way of protecting your gear other than just chucking them into a Pelican case. All that wear and tear of pulling the Atem out, plugging the power in, plugging the HDMI cables in. What's nice here is that since we'll be using SDI to HDMI converters, we're no longer going to be plugging and unplugging constantly, so we're hoping that'll make sure that we don't wear down the HDMI ports nearly as bad. It'll just be the SDI connectors into those adapters that'll be plugging in. So that's one thing that we thought of there. Also, just this case is much more weatherproofed. So if they're sliding this cart outside, if it's kind of out in the elements, the heat, the sun, things like that, it's just going to help us protect it a little bit more. And then also if they wanted to break this away from the cart, so if we were using this for something else, not using the PTZ cameras, they could potentially just unplug the PTZs and take this case off of that rolling cart and put this somewhere else. So just thinking about being modular, being portable, giving them a whole bunch of options. So it's time to begin with this build out. I'm going to supply you with a full parts list that I will put on screen right now. And I'll give you a few seconds to look over that list. We're going to edit that in for you to check out later. We're also going to make sure that we have this linked to below the video so that if you need to buy any of these parts, if you're looking to build something just like this, you can go ahead and find those parts online. And just know that some of these parts came from things that I already had from other builds. A lot of these parts we bought just directly through Amazon or B&H Photo. Those are kind of my main go-tos for getting these parts quickly. And then you have the occasional things like the screen that came from AliExpress because it came straight from China. So let's dig in. Let me talk about how I would think about this build and how I would approach this, because obviously it's, you know, just an empty canvas right now. So I'm going to flip this guy over. And so you can see our rack here. We have 6 U's of space. So a rack unit space typically takes up 3 of these screw holes. You might not be able to see it on camera, but there's little indentations that also divide that up. So what my thinking with this is to create something that will have the screen on top, which is kind of a requirement here because the screen will come out and then flip up. So the screen needs to remain there. On top of, or just below that, I will probably consider putting a fan in the back of the unit so heat rises, making sure that that fan stays higher up since the back of the screen is going to be taking up space all the way through the unit, and that's where the HDMI will plug into the screen. From there, we'll probably look into adding maybe a shelf to include our SDI HDMI bi-directional converters, and then we'll also consider putting in the Ethernet ports, the switch that we got. It's an unmanaged switch that provides PoE just enough to power both of our cameras. Could potentially power one other thing because of the amount that this switch can do. And then we have a sliding rack that's going to hold our Atem. And then on the very bottom, I believe we're going to put our power conditioner. So that's kind of a rough start for how this is going to go. So I'm going to be just jumping out, grabbing parts. We're going to get moving on this. One of the first things that I'll note is the easiest thing to install first is going to be this sliding shelf. Because of how big it is, you actually have to put it in at an angle. And since it's not going on the very bottom, it's going one up. I want to make sure I get that in place first. So I'm going to grab that and then we'll dive into installing it. Okay, so this is our sliding shelf. You can see here, it's got a nice sort of like indented part on the bottom. So I'm going to flip it over. We're probably going to use the top part of this. And the reason why I like this is because it will allow us to slide the Atem completely out of the rack. So you can see it slides out. And that will allow us to store the Atem away nice and safely inside the unit, but also slide it out so it's a little more functional when we're switching. You don't have to like have your hands inside the unit. You can reach everything. So we'll start with this, and we need some screws. I went ahead and bought a whole thing of these rack screws, carbon steel rack screws, because I do have some laying around, but I just wanted for this build everything to be the same, so I didn't want to use any old screws that might be stripped or old parts. So in getting this rack mount in here, what I'm going to do is probably start by angling this in a funky way. So we'll probably have to do some finagling here just to show this properly on camera. And there's no really right or wrong front or back on this case. It's pretty much the same both ways, but I am making sure that the wheels are right here on the bottom of the case as we build this out. So I'm going to make sure this rack is fully just kind of locked in place, and then I'm going to tilt it and then insert. And this is not an easy thing to do to get this to fit properly. But I'll show you what I'm doing here in a second. Okay, so I think we're there. What I had to do was basically line up, there's these little kind of like hook-like things, these arms that are gonna screw into this. So I'll show you when I flip this over here so you can see it better. So you can see here there's these little arms, and this is what screws into the unit itself. And since this one is going to be on rack unit number 2 from the bottom, not the very bottom one, because that's where our power conditioner is going to hide. We're going to just kind of line this up and make sure you put it in properly, so make sure you can actually pull it out. Yep, so make sure you can pull it out. That's the last thing you want to do is like put this in the wrong way. And we'll start screwing in. So I've got 3 screws over here. With this shelf, if it's going to hold a lot of weight, I would do all 3. Since this is mostly just holding the Atem, I'm probably going to do 2 on each side. Be careful, this metal is sharp. You will definitely cut yourself like I did. So that's always fun. And once we've got 2 screws in each side, we'll flip this guy over and we will lock in the other side as well. And I'm making sure to screw these in relatively tight, but not so tight that, that you couldn't get this out and adjust it. Okay, so 4 in, we're going to flip the whole thing over and do the same thing on the other side. Okay. Little thunk there. Make sure it's lined up properly. Again, you don't want to screw this into the wrong spot. And 2 more screws on each side. That's 1 and 2. Once we get all the screws in, we'll flip this thing down on its base and just check it out. Make sure that the shelf opens up properly, that it slides in properly. I'm a big fan of just kind of checking your work as you go along because it's very, very easy to make mistakes. Okay, so this is all 4 screws into our rack case. So let's turn it. And you can see the shelf slid right out, so you know you did something right. And basically this is your shelf that the Atem is going to sit on. So we'll get that in there probably last as we get further down the line, but just making sure that this slides out and locks in place comfortably. So the next piece that we want to get in is either the power conditioner, which goes underneath, or I may elect to do the screen, which mounts to the very, very top of this. So I think we're going to go for that next. Let's go for the screen. Okay, so next up we have our screen. This is straight from China. It's off of AliExpress. It's a 17.3-inch screen. I believe from Fuel World, CTech, they're pretty much the same company. All that stuff comes out of the same place. So let me get this out and then show you how we're going to mount this one. Okay, so as you can see, it's a slide-out monitor. It's all hidden, tucked away inside of this metal casing. But one of the things you want to do is make sure that you mount this properly. So always look at the back of the monitor to figure out which direction the ports are facing. You're going to see like the writing on them. So obviously this is the top right now. This is the right side up. And so I would want to install it this way. Now, the tricky part with this is that there's 2 of these rack mount ears on the front. You can see them right here. But there's none on the back. So this comes with additional hardware. Comes with an extra box here. And you want to make sure that you don't throw this out by accident because this box also has your power cable. And basically how this is going to work is this has the ears for the back side. So you'll slide this in, you'll screw in the front, and then the ears on the back side, there's actually channels on either side of this that these will slide into, and then you screw them in on the back. So let's get started with that. The easiest way for me to do this is to tilt this back up again. Make sure you tilt it the right way. So this is going to be the front of the unit. And then make sure as well, double check you're using the right side of your screen. So get that in there. And the screen is going to slide at an angle just to get it in place. And then what you'll do is you'll just kind of get this right in place to screw in on this side. So again, like I said, we'll put a few screws in over here, and then we'll flip this over and we'll get to the other side. So let me go ahead and get some more. This is probably the longest part of this build, is just getting all the screws in there and trying to figure out where things are going to go naturally, where they're best going to fit, thinking about what might interfere with something else once you have it installed, because you have to remember that this screen goes all the way through to the back, whereas some other rack spaces you might actually be able to put things on both the front and the back. You also want to think about how you're going to run your power cables, how that's all going to fit inside this case. So there's a lot to think about. I definitely recommend, if you have like PowerPoint or something, make yourself like a little sheet that you can, or maybe even an Excel sheet where you can kind of mark off where these items are going. I'm also having trouble getting some of these screws in here. Let's see what we're doing. There we go. So I definitely recommend, taking a few minutes when you have the chance before you really start to build this out. It's going to save you some headache and some frustration if you can kind of map out roughly where stuff's supposed to go. I will say this is one of those things where, like, once you actually get into the build itself, you'll probably find things you didn't think about. Like, one of the things I'm running into here is we might have a bit of a stripped screw hole. No, I think, all right, we're good. These wear and tear over time. Okay, so you can see here I have 4 screws in on the monitor. The monitor is probably one of the heaviest pieces in this unit, so if you did want to include the third middle screw, you certainly could, just for safety. But we're going to go ahead, flip this over, get the back pieces ready to go. I also, again, just can't stress enough checking things before you jump into that. So I'm going to loosen up. These are these little locking knobs, and make sure that this screen pulls out the right direction. And sure enough, it does. So we'll lock this guy back in place. I can't tell you, there was at least once or twice building one of these where I did actually, in fact, install it facing the wrong way, and the screen flipped out upside down. So with this in, I'm going to tilt it on its head, actually, for putting in these remaining pieces. So I'm going to tilt it down this way. And the reason why I did that was because it's heavy, and because the back isn't locked in yet, I don't want it to start tilting down in the back. I want to be able to line it up nice and easily on this side. So down here, we're going to have these little channels that these ears run into. And obviously the ears are going to mount onto the rack itself, but this long portion of it needs to slide in like so. So it's actually going to go in right there. It's going to slide in and then lock into place. Just like that. That's one. Same thing on the other side. And this is much harder to do when you have to hold it open to the camera to show you what's happening. All right, so those are in place. Now that that's in place, I'll flip this up again so I can see it, and I'll get the screws back in for this. Okay. Now, I'm not going to leave it like this for too long because I don't want the shelf or anything to be falling out or applying pressure where it shouldn't be going. We're just going to leave it up here long enough to get our 4 screws into these rack ears. Give you a little better view there. And my thinking and how I built this out was really to make this modular, make this work for the client's needs, but also make this work in a way where if I were jumping in, if I had to train somebody or if I had to use it, it's the way that I would be using it. And so that's why I've kind of chosen how things are going in and where they're going and you know, what items should be going in. You know, I've seen screens that are much lighter and easier to travel with. You've probably seen me in other videos like my teleprompter video that I showed off. There's these smaller like 13-inch screens that you can travel with. They're super light. But I wanted this to really work for the client's needs too and not lose my screws down inside the casing here. So we've got 2 in on the other side. We're going to put our 3rd and 4th one in on this side, and then our pull-out monitor should be in good shape. One thing I do recommend is as you go along in building these, label some of your power supplies, because if you mix up power supplies and you put an overpowered power supply into the wrong device, you might actually fry it. And that's something where I've been there and done that by accident, and it was a very expensive mistake for me to make. And you bet you're behind that I won't be making it again. But I just recommend labeling that stuff. So we've got this in. Let's go ahead and flip this guy back down. And being careful because your shelf is going to slide out. So now you can see we have both our sliding shelf that's going to have our Atem on top of it. And then we've got our slide out monitor. And again, I'll show you here, you just unlock these 2 knobs. And they're good protection to make sure that this doesn't just slide out like the shelf does. And then this comes right out. And once it's all the way out, you flip it up. And that's going to be your screen. Pretty nifty. Little secret when you're locking this back in, you might have to lift up ever so slightly on the handle just to line up where these lock back into place. Okay. Next thing I will go ahead and install is, you know, we're going to leave the power out for right now. That's probably the last thing we'll do. But the next thing I'm going to install is our power conditioner, because that's going to go on the bottom. So let me go ahead and move these all to the side, and we'll keep chugging right along. So let's keep moving ahead, thinking about the next thing that I want to get installed on this. Probably going to be the fan, because I'm thinking on the back of the rack here, the fan is going to be as high as we can get it because heat rises, and it's an exhaust fan. It blows air out the back. So what I'll do is I'll grab our fan and then we'll get that installed. Okay, our fan comes in a couple of parts. One, you have the fan rack unit itself. You have a thermal sensor that plugs into the back, and then of course you have the AC power adapter. So let me go ahead and turn this around to the back so you can see how I get this installed. We're going to flip this up on its head again, just like I have been. Alrighty. Get that. So, the fan, being that we want it as close to the top as possible, is going to go just below our monitor, and that's going to give me just a little space there for this guy, and then we still have all this room down here to build out where the power over Ethernet switch is going to go, and where maybe our shelf is going to go in the back here that holds our converters. So let me get this screwed in, and then you know, later on what we would probably do is figure out running our power cords inside the unit. Fortunately, the fan is so thin that I can reach the back of it pretty easily here. Okay. I imagine this would probably be a little quicker with a power drill. I don't recommend a power drill because it may over tighten these, making it much harder to get them out. So, you know, if you're very careful with it, maybe use one, but I don't recommend doing it unless you're just extremely careful. Okay, fan unit is in. I will flip this back down carefully because the shelf may come out, the sliding shelf. So now you can see it's starting to take shape. It's starting to get a little heavier too. So what I want to focus on next is determining the power over Ethernet situation. We do have a unmanaged switch that provides PoE. That's for our two PTZ cameras. That's probably going to have to go in the back. And the reason why I want to do that is because I don't want the cables and the mess sticking out the front when they might be sitting here trying to operate this. So my thinking is we'll put the switch next, just below the fan, and then that leaves us one more space left over for any sort of rack shelf unit that we might want to install, or potentially in the front here. So we'll have to think that through and figure out what we want to do with that one. So going for the switch next. Okay, this is our Netgear Unmanaged Switch. It's an 8-port PoE switch, and you want to make sure that you check for what amount of power it can supply to each of the different ports, and then also how much in total. So for this one, I believe it's up to 30 watts that we can do, and I know that the cameras, which I did check previously, use less than 30 watts, so we'll be good to go. I think in total, it doesn't say directly on here, but I know when I bought it, I checked to make sure that the total wattage that it can supply did not go beyond the amount of wattage that the two cameras would need to use, 123 watts. So, you know, if you have two cameras that are each using less than 30, obviously you're maxing out at 60 there, so it's not going to be a huge deal. This switch can also be used if you wanted to connect to your Atem, your streaming laptop. However, I don't always recommend that because once you plug it into someone else's network, your IP addresses might change. It might make it harder to access your cameras. So this switch might be best just to be used for keeping your computers on a network. And so just think about that in your builds. So this is our switch. We've got some rack ears and mounting that goes along with this. And very similar to the rack ears that you saw on the monitor, we're using these ears that need to attach to the unit itself. Once you get through all the ridiculous amounts of plastic, you're going to get two ears that look kind of like so. One side for this particular switch, and we will have this in our parts list, one side has 4 screw holes. That's going to go right in here. And then the other side that has 2 big rack mount holes, that's the side that's going to connect to the rack itself. Get our screws out. And what's nice is they've actually given us some cable ties. They've actually given us some rack mount screws for it too. So that's kind of rare that you get that. So be careful with these screws. You don't want to lose one. They're super tiny. And this is how they're going to mount to our switch. So always check, make sure you're mounting it the right way up. It's just one of those things that you want to check before you go screwing stuff in. And then if you have a magnetic screwdriver, that's going to make your life so much easier. I'm using just a crappy one from my toolbox that's sitting in our office here, but highly recommend getting a magnetic one so you can prevent yourself from losing all these tiny little parts. Also just makes it so much easier when trying to screw these in, especially if you have big hands. So we're getting all 4 in. Don't skimp out on this one. Definitely recommend making sure that these are in nice and tight. Don't over tighten it, but you know, this is what's going to be keeping this in the rack unit. So you want to make sure that it's definitely not going to fall out. And again, this is just like the most time-consuming part of all of this mess is getting all these tiny screws in. You know, once you get it in, you realize it's upside down. So take your time with this. If you haven't done this before, don't over tighten anything just yet because there's a good chance you're gonna have to take it out again. And then with this one, when I go to screw the other side in, I recommend using the edge of the table because I can't just sit this down. So I'll actually use the edge of the table and then I'll just lean it against my chest here, and that makes it a little bit easier for getting these screws in. And I've gotten some questions in the past of, you know, can you offer a service to build these for us? And the reason why is it would take me, as you can see, a very long time just to get one of these out the door. And that's, you know, on top of considering the parts you need to change out for every sort of custom build. So unfortunately, my friends, Zeffin's shop of rack building is not open for business. But that's why we're creating these videos to teach you how you could be doing it on your own. So now we've got all 8 of those screws in. It's time to get this mounted inside the unit. Again, don't forget, I decided that this makes the most sense mounting it to the back because that's where the cables will be running out of. So we're gonna just slide this guy around. And watch out for your power cable. It's gonna get in the way a little bit. We'll get our rack screws. Definitely save some of these parts for a few weeks after you get them because you still have to plug it in, test it, make sure everything's working properly. This one's a little challenging to screw in because you just have to like hold it up to the rack while you put it in. So I'll get one side in first. And not going to lock this down just yet. Just get one screw in to hold it up and then we'll get the other side. Then once you've got those 2 in, get the remaining 2. And so again, this switch is not planned to be used for the internet. It's just our streaming computer that's going to be connected to the internet, or maybe even just the Atem directly, depending on what platform they're using. They like to use Zoom a lot, so they might not even use the built-in encoder. But that's just this particular client. Okay, so we're finally taking shape here. Just to review what we have here, we've got our monitor on the top. This is the back side of the monitor, so that's just so we can access the HDMI port and the power plug. That's going to later on be kind of hidden and tucked away inside of the rack case. Then below it we have our exhaust fan. This is up high because we want our heat to dissipate, so if heat rises, we're going to suck that heat out and blow it out the back. And then we also have our switch mounted just below it. That's so that we can power our PoE PTZ cameras. And so that's going to send it that way. Now, really the only remaining thing is getting our SDI to HDMI adapters in here. There's 3 of which we will need. Why 3? Because I want to make sure that if they run a feed from a laptop that's 200 feet away on the other side of the room, that we can bring the laptop feed in as well. And so what I purchased for that in particular is a decimator MDHX that allows me to do all the scaling and cross conversion. That will go on the laptop side. They run an SDI cable all the way back to here. SDI is converted to HDMI going into the Atem. So 1 converter for the laptop and then 2 for each of their 2 cameras. So I want that to live on a shelf, but I need to think this through because what's going to happen here is the Atem is going to slide out and the Atem is going to take up some space. So let me slide this around. We're going to open up our Atem and just pop it in here and show you all the space that it's going to take up and how it doesn't fit perfectly on a 1 RU shelf. It actually raises up above it because of this sliding shelf that we use. So give me 1 second. We're going to flip this around and then we're going to get our Atem ready to show you where that will go. So here's the Atem, brand new, fresh out of the box. I'm not taking anything else out right now. This is just to show you how this is going to fit and to give you an idea of what you should be thinking about when you're building your rack cases. So I'm going to leave this box up top here for a second. So here's the Atem. So notice how it sits on this shelf, but if you close this, it's going to be higher. It's actually going to be hitting the other rack-mounted shelves. So this is something that you really need to take into consideration when you're building this out, is because you need to leave yourself enough space for this, or you need a rack mount shelf that sits the Atem on the bottom and doesn't have this lip up that takes up all this space here, right? So that's taking up a good like 2/3 of the rack unit space. So really you need like 2 RU spaces for this. Now, fortunately, the only other thing that I'm actually fitting into here is going to be my shelf that has my adapters and converters. So, you know, that could be fit on either side of this, but just keep all this in mind as you're building your stuff out. The Atem, by the way, is most likely going to be some sticky tape that's holding this down onto the rack shelf, but it does also have some holes in here if we wanted to use some zip ties or things like that. Okay, so that's just to show you where the Atem itself is going to go. The last piece that we really need to build out is going to be our adapters and converters. And I have 2 options for this. I have 2 shelves that I bought. And we're going to take a look at both of them, kind of envision how they would fit in here, and that's how we'll make our determination. So let me move some boxes off to the side here and get some things out of the way. Okay, rack shelves. These shelves do not have a back that mounts, so it only mounts in the front to the rails. And one is just a little bit bigger than the other. For me, it's just about kind of fitting this in, seeing how it's going to look, and making the best determination as to what you're going to do with it. The other thing we need to think about is how many converters need to fit across this. So let me grab the converters. In this build, we're using 3 of the bi-directional SDI to HDMI 3G converters. This one came with the power adapter, and again, we're going to link to this in our parts section. So the converter itself is actually pretty small, but you have to think about the fact that they're going to be running SDI cables to this. So is it going to make the most sense to mount this in the back? Probably, so they can just run the cables to it, and especially since the cable that we got this particular client is a combined SDI and Ethernet cable, so we need to make sure that we can give them access to both of those in the same positioning. So what I'm thinking is we're probably going to go with our smaller rack shelf over the bigger rack shelf, because you can see how tiny this is. If I flip this up for you, you'll actually be able to see it takes up very, very little space. So to fit 3 of these on here should be pretty darn easy, and that's something that we're going to do with some zip ties. So what I'll do is I'll determine the best way to face this. Since it's mounted in the back, I'm going to make sure the ears are facing back this way. And then before we even screw this in, we're actually going to take all 3 of our bidirectional converters, and we're going to mount them with the SDIs facing out towards the back, so they can simply just screw in the SDI cable as need be. So I'm going to get all 3 of these out, and we're going to get some cable ties that we'll use to keep these in place. All right, so this is all 3 of these. And let me get rid of some things off the table, clean this off, and then we'll go from a top-down look just so you can see as I'm doing this. All right, so you can see I'm just kind of evenly spacing these out here. And this is roughly how they're going to sit, and this shelf is going to mount into the back of the unit. So it's actually going to flip this around this way. There you go, and just with our kind of theme of envisioning how this is all going to fit and work, we'll just kind of slide this in here just so you can see and get a picture of where it will go. And it's going to sit right above this sliding shelf, but you need to make sure there's enough room for the Atem. So I'm going to just sit it there, grab the Atem, make sure I have enough room for that shelf to slide in and out. Okay, so I've got my Atem, I've got my shelf just preliminary sitting in there, it's not screwed in. I'm going to just kind of put this Atem on the sliding shelf on the opposite side and make sure it's not going to hit the shelf. And I know I'm making this look like it's super heavy. It's heavy, but it's not that heavy. It's just because of how we're filming this, it's easier to kind of demonstrate and show you what's going on. So the key here is to make sure that I can close this shelf with the Atem on it without it hitting that shelf in the back. And it's pretty much a perfect fit, so we're going to stick with that for right now. Let me go ahead and get this shelf back out of here. We'll get our cable ties, and we'll get these locked in and ready to go. Okay, cable ties. I went for color-coded in some different shapes and sizes, and that's mostly because I want the client to be able to look at the back and say something like, oh, the computer goes in the orange, camera 1 goes in blue, just something to make sure that it's very easy for them to figure out what to do. So I'm going to hold off on the black ones for right now and just set these off to the side. Let's get our canister of these opened up. And I think we're going to go with, let's see, got to make sure they're long enough to fit all the way around. Let's see if we can go, I think an orange one should be able to, might have to use 2. I'll pull out 2 of these just because of the length. We'll go 2 blue ones for this other one. And I think we'll do, I think we're going neon yellow for the third. So probably going to double these up. So this is also one of those time-consuming things that's just going to take a little bit to get this right. What I'll first do is I'll start off by attaching some zip ties here. So we'll start with one. And what I'm going to try to do is to get a zip tie between these SDI locking connectors, okay? So put one through, and then what I think we'll do is we'll put the second one very loose. And just kind of wrap this through. And we'll lock this on the other side. So that's just sitting loosely in there. Now the trick is just figuring out locking it in. So we're going to tighten down a couple of these. And before I lock it in all the way, I'm probably going to take another one around the side and go the other way. So we'll get two more orange. Feed that through the bottom. I'm going to feed it underneath and then through. And this one may actually fit. It's a tight squeeze, but I think just in case, we'll go for the additional. Cable ties for the win today. So again, just check it all, check your work before you lock it down entirely. Make sure it doesn't get in the way of your HDMI cables and where those are going to fit in. So now you can see as we lock this down a little bit more, we should have no problem securing this. So what I'll do is I'll go down the line before I cut off the ends and the extra, and then I'll lock it all in. So let's go for our blue one. We're going to need two more blues. And same exact method. Because of how the holes are in this slot, I'm probably going to just line this up a little bit off center. I'm sorry for anyone that might be OCD if this pains you to see. And again, same thing. We're going to bring this in this way. And flip this over. It's going to slide out as you go. That's fine. We'll tighten it up as we go along. And then same deal on the sides for getting the sides in place. Going to go under, make like a box. Then we'll attach another one here. slid out just a little bit. Get this back in place. This one I'm going to go a little crooked around the center, and it's just because of how the holes are lined up here. But once we lock it down, we'll be fine. So you can see here, this one's kind of wrapped a little bit more diagonally. That's okay. Tighten some things down. So this is number 2. And lock it in. Getting pretty close here to being totally tight. So now we've just got one more of these adapters that needs to go in, and that's this guy on the end. And I never promised that I would be super clean with these. I would love for this to be perfectly straight, but we don't live in a perfect world. So next one up. Get this in place. And again, just kind of lightly lock it in. We're going to have to readjust it once we flip this back over. Cool. So that's not totally locked in just yet, just enough space for me to lock the sides in. Make sure this goes under, just a little more secure that way. Okay. All 3 in. So now we're going to lock them down, tighten them up. Looking pretty good. And now these are fairly darn secure. They're not going to go anywhere. I would say that it's safe for us to go ahead and cut the excess off. So we'll just check it one more time. Make sure everything's nice and tight. Okay. Once you've done that, I'd say you're safe to cut them off. So not cutting off the whole thing, just the excess. This is just getting them out of the way. You can always retie these down later, make it cleaner if you wanted to. But for me, it's just about making sure they're secure, so when this case moves around, that none of these are going to fall out. Okay, whew. That was a lot. A little time consuming there, but we did it. We've got our shelf in place. Now it's time to actually get this installed into our rack unit. So let's go ahead and let's get this puppy screwed in. One thing that I will probably consider doing first is if you have HDMI cables that are going to plug into the Atem, which I will, then I would plug it at least into the converter side. That way it's in there and ready to go. Just for demonstration purposes in this video, I'm going to go ahead and place this in. And you know what? I'll flip this on its head so you can see as I do it. There you go. Okay, big thud. Be a little more careful with your gear than I am. So again, making sure the SDI connectors are facing out the back so that it's much easier for the client to go ahead and just plug stuff in. And once you have these locked in place, for the most part, you're about 90% done. The only thing from here that you really need to do is just run your cables internally inside your rack case. And you know, that's going to take a little bit of time in figuring out, but once you kind of have that, then you're good to go. And in the case of this case, we'd be good to get this ready to deliver to the client. So once I get these in here, I'll show you where we're at on both sides of the case. All right, that shelf is nice and locked in. Just tighten it down a little more. Not too much, don't want to strip any screws, but don't want this to go anywhere. Okay, let me flip this back down and we'll show you what it looks like. Carefully, because the shelf. All right, so, whew, that was a build. So bottom to top, on the bottom we have our power conditioner. Again, might consider replacing that with one that fits a little better. Next to that we have our slide out shelf. That's where our Atem is gonna go. That gives us tons of open airspace and room for airflow, which I really like. You could potentially add another shelf up here if you want to store a few other things, maybe some hyperdecks. And then you have your pull-out monitor on top. Let's flip this guy around. On the back side, okay, we've got our power conditioner on the very bottom. The second rack unit space is for the sliding shelf, so we make sure that you know, we've got some empty room there for that to slide in. Then we have our shelf with our SDI and HDMI bidirectional converters. We have our switch, then we have our exhaust fan, and the back side of our monitor. So, 1 hour to get this entire rack unit put together. Definitely some more just troubleshooting and figuring stuff out when it comes to running that wiring on the inside. But this gets us a very large portion of the way there for getting this completed. So if you have joined me this far along in this entire rack build, kudos to you for paying attention for this long. I know that we just went over a ton of stuff, but I congratulate you for staying along for the ride. I know for me it was a lot of talking. We will make sure that we get all of the parts lists to you, so be sure to check below this video if you're looking for direct links to any of these parts. I'm going to link to, as best as possible, everything that I use for this, including the case, but I know that, you know, sometimes parts get delayed in shipment, sometimes parts are unavailable, so we will do our best if there's something that we can't provide you the exact model, like that sliding shelf, that we can give you something that looks very, very similar and acts very similar to it. So thank you all for watching this video, and I appreciate any and all comments or questions. Let me know. Thanks.